My name is Victoria. I am 34 years old, and my parents decided my cousin's luxury wedding reception was the perfect moment to remind me of my place. When my mother leaned over the linen tablecloth to whisper that I was the ultimate disappointment compared to my sister's wealthy husband, I took a slow sip of my water. I said nothing. A few minutes later, the groom stood up to deliver his toast. He raised his glass to the room and thanked the single person who had secretly funded the entire event. When he said my name, my mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. What my family did not realize was that the humiliation of that moment was only the beginning. My phone was already vibrating with a fraud alert that would unravel their entire fake empire. Before I tell you how I dismantled their parasitic lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch toxic family members dig their own graves. The crystal champagne flutes clinked against the backdrop of the snow-covered Aspen peaks. The reception was a flawless display of high society elegance, but the atmosphere at our table felt suffocating. My mother, Patricia, leaned close to my ear. Her voice barely registered over the string quartet, but her words carried the familiar sting I had endured for decades. She looked at my tailored charcoal business suit, sighed, and whispered that I was a living embarrassment. She gestured across the table toward my younger sister Chloe and her husband Marcus. Marcus wore a velvet dinner jacket and flashed a heavy platinum watch, projecting the image of a wildly successful crypto hedge fund manager. I kept my face blank and took a slow sip of sparkling water. Arguing with Patricia was always a losing game. I preferred to let reality do the talking. The room grew quiet as my cousin Julian the groom stood up from the head table. He tapped a silver spoon against his glass, drawing the attention of the 200 guests. Julian smiled warmly at his new bride Maya, then turned his gaze directly toward our table. He spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing across the ballroom. He announced that before he could celebrate his new marriage, he needed to acknowledge the person who made the entire weekend possible. He told the crowd that this $150,000 reception was not funded by his parents or his savings. He raised his glass and thanked his cousin Victoria for secretly sponsoring every single detail. The heavy silver fork in my mother's hand froze halfway to her mouth. The blood drained from her perfectly contoured face. Across the table, the smug grin vanished from Chloe's lips. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the floor. The applause erupted around us, forcing my parents to paint tight smiles on their faces while glaring daggers in my direction. The applause had not even faded when a sharp vibration buzzed against my thigh. I slipped my phone from my pocket, keeping it shielded under the linen tablecloth. It was an automated push notification from my corporate financial artificial intelligence system. The screen displayed a real-time alert for a highly suspicious transaction. A $25,000 charge had just been processed at the resort VIP casino downstairs. The card used was an emergency secondary account tied to my corporate firm. The authorized user profile linked to the swipe belonged to Marcus. My brother-in-law was not just sitting across from me playing the wealthy visionary. He was actively draining my company funds to feed a gambling habit right in the middle of a wedding reception. The guests at the neighboring tables murmured in quiet awe, turning their heads to look at our table. My father Richard could not stomach the idea of his quiet, overlooked daughter commanding the spotlight. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie, and leaned back in his chair with a practiced artificial chuckle. He projected his voice, ensuring the wealthy attendees nearby caught every syllable. He announced that he had spent decades teaching me the intricate mechanisms of wealth accumulation. He proudly claimed my financial success was merely a direct reflection of his superior parental guidance and early investment lessons. I rested my hands on my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my trousers. Richard had never taught me a single thing about finance. He was a mid-level regional manager who spent his career drowning in credit card debt to maintain a country club membership he could barely afford. I built my mergers and acquisitions portfolio by working 90-hour weeks on Wall Street while he funded Chloe and Marcus. I did not correct him. Letting a fool stroke his own ego is often the easiest way to keep him blind to the trap you are setting. Marcus sensed an opportunity. The public revelation that I possessed enough liquid capital to casually drop $150,000 on a wedding shifted his entire demeanor. He slid his chair closer to mine, invading my personal space. The cloying scent of his designer cologne masked the faint sweat of pure desperation on his brow. He leaned in, resting his elbow on the table, and flashed his signature charismatic grin. He whispered that he was incredibly impressed by my generosity. Then, without skipping a single beat, he casually mentioned a temporary liquidity bottleneck in his primary trading account. He asked if I could wire him $50,000 by tomorrow morning to cover a minor margin call. He promised a guaranteed 30% return within the month, boasting about a proprietary crypto algorithm his hedge fund had just developed. The context of his request was laughable. Marcus marketed himself as an elite digital asset visionary. He drove a leased European sports car and wore bespoke suits. My parents treated him like a financial oracle, constantly demanding I take business advice from him. In reality, he was a textbook grifter. He possessed no actual licenses, managed no real portfolios, and survived entirely on the illusion of wealth. He was a parasite wearing luxury brands, relying on my parents' blind favoritism to fund his hollow existence. I turned my head and looked directly into his eyes. He expected me to cave under the pressure of family duty. I offered a thin, polite smile. I told him I needed to check my accounts and would discuss it after I used the restroom. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, and walked away from the table, leaving him stewing in his own manufactured anxiety. The resort ballroom gave way to a quiet, dimly lit corridor leading to the private guest suites and facilities. I slipped into the gold-plated VIP restroom and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The ambient jazz music playing through the ceiling speakers provided a perfect layer of white noise. I set my clutch on the polished marble vanity and pulled out my ultra-thin encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a pale blue glow across my face. I was no longer the quiet sister sitting at a dinner table. I transitioned instantly into a senior partner executing a forensic audit. I connected to a secure virtual private network and bypassed the standard user interfaces, diving straight into the raw transaction ledgers of my corporate accounts. The $25,000 casino swipe was merely the tip of the iceberg. I isolated the specific secondary credit card tied to that fraudulent charge. Years ago, I had issued a backup card to my mother, Patricia, strictly for genuine family medical emergencies. I set the parameters to pull every single transaction routed through her specific user profile over the past 6 months. The data populated on my screen in neat, undeniable rows. My jaw tightened as I scrolled through the sheer volume of unauthorized transfers. This was not a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a systematic, calculated extraction. Patricia had willingly handed over the digital access codes and the physical card details to Marcus. I tracked the flow of the stolen capital. $5,000 routed through a third-party payment processor in January. $12,000 wired to an offshore exchange in February. By the time I reached the current date, the total stolen amount surpassed $300,000. Every single cent of that money belonged to my firm. I ran a reverse trace on the destination accounts. The funds were not sitting in a legitimate investment portfolio. Marcus had been dumping my hard-earned capital into a notoriously volatile cryptocurrency staking platform. A brief cross-reference with the global financial registries confirmed what my instincts already knew. The platform was a blatant Ponzi scheme, and it was currently in the middle of a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The entire structure was collapsing, and Marcus was desperately throwing stolen money into a black hole, hoping to salvage his fake reputation. The reality of the situation painted a very clear and disturbing picture. My parents were not just oblivious victims of his charm. Patricia knowingly facilitated grand larceny. She enabled a grifter to bleed her own daughter dry just to uphold the facade that her youngest child had married a billionaire. They were literally feeding my lifeblood to a malignant tumor to protect their social status. I closed the laptop, sliding it back into my leather bag. The betrayal did not bring me to tears. It brought me terrifying clarity. Marcus wanted $50,000 by tomorrow morning to save his neck. Patricia wanted to play the wealthy matriarch. Richard wanted to claim credit for my success. They thought I was a bottomless well of resources they could exploit without facing any consequences. I looked at my reflection in the gold-trimmed mirror and took a deep breath. They wanted to play a high-stakes financial game, but they forgot who actually owned the casino. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped back out into the corridor. It was time to sever the umbilical cord. Instead of causing a scene, I pulled my phone from my pocket and prepared to execute a digital strike that would leave them stranded in the middle of the Aspen Mountains. The guests at the neighboring tables murmured in quiet awe, turning their heads to look at our table. My father Richard could not stomach the idea of his quiet, overlooked daughter commanding the spotlight. He cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie, and leaned back in his chair with a practiced artificial chuckle. He projected his voice, ensuring the wealthy attendees nearby caught every syllable. He announced that he had spent decades teaching me the intricate mechanisms of wealth accumulation. He proudly claimed my financial success was merely a direct reflection of his superior parental guidance and early investment lessons. I rested my hands on my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my trousers. Richard had never taught me a single thing about finance. He was a mid-level regional manager who spent his career drowning in credit card debt to maintain a country club membership he could barely afford. I built my mergers and acquisitions portfolio by working 90-hour weeks on Wall Street while he funded Chloe and Marcus. I did not correct him. Letting a fool stroke his own ego is often the easiest way to keep him blind to the trap you are setting. Marcus sensed an opportunity. The public revelation that I possessed enough liquid capital to casually drop $150,000 on a wedding shifted his entire demeanor. He slid his chair closer to mine, invading my personal space. The cloying scent of his designer cologne masked the faint sweat of pure desperation on his brow. He leaned in, resting his elbow on the table, and flashed his signature charismatic grin. He whispered that he was incredibly impressed by my generosity. Then, without skipping a single beat, he casually mentioned a temporary liquidity bottleneck in his primary trading account. He asked if I could wire him $50,000 by tomorrow morning to cover a minor margin call. He promised a guaranteed 30% return within the month, boasting about a proprietary crypto algorithm his hedge fund had just developed. The context of his request was laughable. Marcus marketed himself as an elite digital asset visionary. He drove a leased European sports car and wore bespoke suits. My parents treated him like a financial oracle, constantly demanding I take business advice from him. In reality, he was a textbook grifter. He possessed no actual licenses, managed no real portfolios, and survived entirely on the illusion of wealth. He was a parasite wearing luxury brands, relying on my parents' blind favoritism to fund his hollow existence. I turned my head and looked directly into his eyes. He expected me to cave under the pressure of family duty. I offered a thin, polite smile. I told him I needed to check my accounts and would discuss it after I used the restroom. I stood up, smoothing my jacket, and walked away from the table, leaving him stewing in his own manufactured anxiety. The resort ballroom gave way to a quiet, dimly lit corridor leading to the private guest suites and facilities. I slipped into the gold-plated VIP restroom and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The ambient jazz music playing through the ceiling speakers provided a perfect layer of white noise. I set my clutch on the polished marble vanity and pulled out my ultra-thin encrypted laptop. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a pale blue glow across my face. I was no longer the quiet sister sitting at a dinner table. I transitioned instantly into a senior partner executing a forensic audit. I connected to a secure virtual private network and bypassed the standard user interfaces, diving straight into the raw transaction ledgers of my corporate accounts. The $25,000 casino swipe was merely the tip of the iceberg. I isolated the specific secondary credit card tied to that fraudulent charge. Years ago, I had issued a backup card to my mother, Patricia, strictly for genuine family medical emergencies. I set the parameters to pull every single transaction routed through her specific user profile over the past 6 months. The data populated on my screen in neat, undeniable rows. My jaw tightened as I scrolled through the sheer volume of unauthorized transfers. This was not a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a systematic, calculated extraction. Patricia had willingly handed over the digital access codes and the physical card details to Marcus. I tracked the flow of the stolen capital. $5,000 routed through a third-party payment processor in January, $12,000 wired to an offshore exchange in February. By the time I reached the current date, the total stolen amount surpassed $300,000. Every single cent of that money belonged to my firm. I ran a reverse trace on the destination accounts. The funds were not sitting in a legitimate investment portfolio. Marcus had been dumping my hard-earned capital into a notoriously volatile cryptocurrency staking platform. A brief cross-reference with global financial registries confirmed what my instincts already knew. The platform was a blatant Ponzi scheme, and it was currently in the middle of a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The entire structure was collapsing, and Marcus was desperately throwing stolen money into a black hole, hoping to salvage his fake reputation. The reality of the situation painted a very clear and disturbing picture. My parents were not just oblivious victims of his charm. Patricia knowingly facilitated grand larceny. She enabled a grifter to bleed her own daughter dry just to uphold the facade that her youngest child had married a billionaire. They were literally feeding my lifeblood to a malignant tumor to protect their social status. I closed the laptop, sliding it back into my leather bag. The betrayal did not bring me to tears. It brought me terrifying clarity. Marcus wanted $50,000 by tomorrow morning to save his neck. Patricia wanted to play the wealthy matriarch. Richard wanted to claim credit for my success. They thought I was a bottomless well of resources they could exploit without facing any consequences. I looked at my reflection in the gold-trimmed mirror and took a deep breath. They wanted to play a high-stakes financial game, but they forgot who actually owned the casino. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped back out into the corridor. It was time to sever the umbilical cord. Instead of causing a scene, I pulled my phone from my pocket and prepared to execute a digital strike that would leave them stranded in the middle of the Aspen Mountains. I stood in the quiet corridor holding my encrypted device. The faint sound of classical strings drifted through the thick mahogany doors, separating me from the reception. The average person discovering a theft of $300,000 would storm into the ballroom, causing a public spectacle fueled by raw emotion. My training on Wall Street taught me that emotion is a liability. True power lies in swift, invisible execution. I opened the primary administrative portal for my corporate accounts. The interface required multiple layers of biometric authentication, which I bypassed with practiced efficiency. I located the specific subsidiary branch containing the profiles for both Patricia and Richard. They believed they were untouchable because they held physical plastic bearing their names. They failed to comprehend that I controlled the central nervous system of that plastic. I highlighted their profiles. I did not simply suspend their spending limits. A temporary suspension could be contested or overridden by a smooth-talking phone call to customer service. I navigated to the root security architecture of the banking application. I initiated a permanent structural termination for their specific user identities. I selected the administrative option to flag the entire 6-month transaction history under a severe widespread fraud classification. I submitted the digital dossier directly to the highest tier of the American Express Security Division. This action triggered an automated federal oversight algorithm. The banking institution instantly classified my parents and Marcus as hostile financial threats. Every single account linked to their Social Security numbers through my corporate umbrella was paralyzed. The digital guillotine fell without a single drop of spilled blood. I watched the status bars on my screen turn from green to a stark, unforgiving gray. The connection was severed. I locked my device and slid it into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I adjusted my cuffs and breathed in the crisp, conditioned air of the resort. My pulse was steady. I walked back toward the grand ballroom, ready to watch the poison take effect. The reception was in full swing by the time I returned to my designated seat. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted prime rib. The wealthiest individuals in the state were mingling, exchanging business cards, and discussing their winter portfolios. At our specific table, Patricia was orchestrating a scene of supreme artificial dominance. She had summoned the senior event director to our table. The director was a tall, impeccably groomed man, wearing a sharp navy suit with an earpiece discreetly tucked into his collar. He stood at attention holding a sleek digital payment terminal while Patricia dictated her demands. She spoke with an elevated volume, ensuring the venture capitalists seated at the adjacent tables could hear every word of her manufactured generosity. She instructed the director to book the exclusive sunset yacht package for the following afternoon. She detailed how the private boat tour, complete with a personal chef and vintage champagne, was a necessary gift for her brilliant son-in-law. She gestured toward Marcus, praising his grueling schedule managing his crypto hedge fund. She claimed he needed a lavish day of relaxation after generating so much wealth for their family. Marcus sat there soaking in the unearned praise, adjusting his velvet dinner jacket and attempting to look burdened by his own imaginary success. Chloe smiled proudly, resting her hand on his arm. I took my seat quietly, picking up my crystal water goblet. I watched the performance unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a doomed experiment. Patricia reached into her designer clutch and produced the silver corporate card. She flicked her wrist, extending the card toward the director with a dismissive wave. The director accepted the payment method with a polite nod. He entered the $15,000 total into his sleek mobile terminal. He inserted the metallic chip into the reader. The ambient chatter of the ballroom seemed to fade into a low hum. I kept my eyes fixed on the small digital screen facing away from Patricia. The machine initiated the handshake protocol with the central banking servers. It sought authorization for the luxury purchase. A sharp, flat tone emitted from the device. The screen illuminated with a bright red warning banner. The transaction was denied. The director maintained his polished customer service demeanor. He offered a practiced apologetic smile and suggested there might be a minor connectivity issue with the local resort network. Patricia let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes and apologizing loudly to Marcus for the terrible service at this supposedly elite venue. She ordered the director to run the card again using the magnetic strip. The director obliged. He slid the card through the side reader. The machine processed for 3 grueling seconds. The silence at our table grew dense. The terminal produced a second tone, but this sound was distinctively different. It was a prolonged, harsh beep, signaling a critical failure. The screen did not just display a decline notice. It displayed a mandatory confiscation order. The bank had locked the terminal, preventing any further attempts, and instructing the merchant to retain the fraudulent plastic. The director stared at the screen for a fraction of a second before looking down at Patricia. His entire posture shifted. The differential warmth evaporated, replaced instantly by the rigid protocol of a high-end security enforcer handling a trespasser. He placed the terminal on the linen tablecloth right next to her untouched plate of food. He did not lower his voice to spare her feelings. He spoke clearly and deliberately, ensuring his words carried the necessary weight. He informed her that the issuing financial institution had permanently frozen the account, citing a severe, widespread fraud alert. He stated that the card was now void and legally confiscated by the merchant. The director then locked his gaze onto Patricia and delivered the final blow. He requested that she provide an alternative valid form of payment for the services already rendered during the reception, or he would be forced to ask her and her immediate party to vacate the restricted VIP seating area. The impact of his words hit the table like a physical shockwave. The surrounding guests, who had been eavesdropping on her previous boasting, now turned their full attention to the unfolding disaster. The quiet whispers of the Aspen elite began to ripple through the room. They recognized the distinct odor of fake wealth collapsing under scrutiny. Patricia turned a deep, humiliating shade of crimson. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound emerged. She frantically dug through her designer clutch, searching for another credit card, but she had nothing else to offer. Her entire identity was funded by the very account I had just destroyed. Richard panicked, attempting to salvage the situation. He pulled his own personal debit card from his wallet and thrust it toward the director. He muttered something about a simple banking error, but everyone at the table knew his personal account could never clear a $15,000 hold. Marcus slumped deep into his chair. The false bravado melted off his face, leaving behind the terrified expression of a cornered animal. He knew exactly what a fraud alert meant. He realized the money pipeline feeding his failing crypto scheme had just been severed. Chloe looked back and forth between her husband and her mother, her eyes wide with uncomprehending panic. Patricia slowly turned her head toward me. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place behind her eyes. She remembered my quiet departure to the restroom. She saw the calm, unbothered expression on my face as I watched her world burn. The deep crimson flush of embarrassment drained entirely from her skin, leaving her face a chalky, sickening white. Her chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath. She was exposed, isolated, and broke in a room full of billionaires. I set my crystal goblet down on the table. The water rippled slightly, reflecting the dim light of the chandeliers. The quiet devastation was a masterpiece of financial execution, but cornered animals rarely surrender without a fight. Richard stood up his chair, scraping harshly against the floorboards, preparing to drag this silent war into a very dark and desperate place. The scrape of Richard pulling his chair back echoed like a gunshot over our table. He did not offer a polite excuse to the bewildered guests staring at us. He reached out and wrapped his fingers around my upper arm. His grip was tight, betraying the sheer panic coursing through his veins. He muttered a terse command under his breath, ordering me to stand up and follow him. Patricia rose swiftly, keeping her head ducked to avoid eye contact with the resort director, who still held the confiscated credit card. Chloe scrambled out of her seat, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. They left Marcus sitting alone at the table, surrounded by half-empty champagne flutes and the burning judgment of his supposed peers. Richard marched me out of the grand ballroom, steering us away from the glittering chandeliers and the lively string quartet. We moved into a secluded service corridor near the resort kitchens. The air here was stark and chilly, stripped of the floral arrangements and elegant decor that masked the reality of the venue. The heavy doors swung shut, cutting off the music and plunging us into a tense, suffocating quiet. There was no preamble, there was no apology for the public humiliation I had endured just an hour prior. My father released my arm and spun around to face me. The polished demeanor of a proud patriarch dissolved, revealing a frantic, desperate man staring down the barrel of financial ruin. He demanded I open my phone and reverse the fraud alert. He spoke in rapid, breathless sentences, ordering me to call the concierge desk and authorize the yacht payment before the entire society circle labeled them as frauds. I leaned against the cool plaster wall, smoothing the sleeve of my charcoal suit. I looked at the three of them. Patricia was trembling, her hands clutching her evening gown. Chloe paced the narrow hallway, her breathing erratic. I told Richard the card was permanently canceled. I informed him that funneling $300,000 of corporate capital into a failing digital currency scheme was a federal offense, and I would not finance another second of their delusion. The color drained from my father's face. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the service corridor highlighted the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes. He realized intimidation would not work. The illusion of his authority fractured, and the ugly truth spilled out in a rushed, terrified confession. He stepped closer, dropping his voice into a hoarse whisper. He revealed the true nature of their financial alliance with Marcus. The luxurious lifestyle my parents paraded in front of their friends was a hollow shell held together by a terrifying gamble. 6 months ago, Marcus had convinced Richard that his proprietary crypto algorithm was guaranteed to triple their net worth. Blinded by greed and a desperate need to maintain his country club status, Richard bypassed his standard bank and approached an alternative lending institution. He took out a high-interest adjustable-rate mortgage leveraging every single cent of equity in their sprawling family estate. He handed the entire lump sum to Marcus to back the hedge fund. The gravity of his confession hung in the cold air. My parents had tied their primary residence to a volatile digital Ponzi scheme. Marcus had squandered their mortgage money just as quickly as he had drained my corporate card. Richard explained that the crypto platform was demanding an immediate infusion of capital to cover an unexpected shortfall. If Marcus defaulted on his margin call tomorrow morning, the collateral cascade would begin. The alternative lending firm would initiate an accelerated foreclosure. Richard and Patricia would lose the house. They would be left with nothing but insurmountable debt. They were staring at imminent homelessness, and they expected me to empty my accounts to save their estate. I stared at my father, digesting the sheer magnitude of his reckless stupidity. They were willing to bleed my firm dry to plug the holes in a sinking ship they had built themselves. I shook my head, delivering my refusal with a calm, flat tone. I told them their debt was not my liability. I turned to walk back down the corridor, ready to pack my bags and leave Aspen behind. Chloe stepped directly into my path, blocking the exit. The spoiled, coddled sister vanished, replaced by a venomous opportunist fighting for her survival. She knew Marcus was ruined. She knew her parents were bankrupt. She realized tears and pleas would not sway me. She pivoted to a much darker tactic. She crossed her arms and leveled a chilling, unblinking glare at me. She mentioned my upcoming promotion. In the world of Wall Street mergers and acquisitions, the ascension to managing partner is a grueling, decade-long battle. It requires an immaculate track record. Corporate boards conduct microscopic audits of a candidate's personal and professional life. The slightest hint of scandal, even an unproven allegation, forces the compliance department to freeze any promotion indefinitely. Chloe smiled a sharp, terrifying expression. She told me she had memorized the names of the senior partners on my executive board. She threatened to draft a formal ethics complaint and send it directly to the firm's compliance division by sunrise. She promised to fabricate a detailed narrative accusing me of elder abuse and systemic embezzlement. She would claim I had manipulated my parents into poverty and stolen family trust funds to inflate my own investment portfolio. She leaned closer, her voice laced with venom. She admitted the board would eventually find the claims baseless, but the ensuing internal investigation would take months. The optics of a messy public family lawsuit would force the firm to pass me over for the managing partner seat. My reputation in the financial sector would be permanently tainted. She was using the single thing I valued most, my career, as leverage. She demanded I wire the $50,000 to Marcus by morning, or she would make the phone call and detonate my professional future. The service corridor fell dead silent. Richard and Patricia watched me holding their breath, waiting for the threat to break my resolve. They had played their final card. They truly believed they had cornered me. They assumed that preserving my career was worth the price of a $50,000 ransom. I looked at Chloe. I looked at the dark, malicious triumph swimming in her eyes. I observed Patricia gripping Richard's arm, waiting for my submission. They expected anger. They expected me to bargain, to beg them not to ruin my life's work. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to reason with them. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the hallway became unbearable. I locked my eyes onto Chloe, tilting my head just a fraction of an inch. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the cold, detached expression of a predator recognizing that the prey had just willingly walked into a closed pen. They thought threatening a Wall Street executive with a financial audit was a winning strategy. They failed to realize they had just invited a shark to a feeding frenzy. I gave a single, distinct nod. I did not utter a word of confirmation or denial. I simply turned on my heel and walked down the long corridor, my footsteps echoing rhythmically against the concrete floor. I did not return to the ballroom. I did not collect my coat from the coat check. I walked straight out the rear exit of the resort and into the freezing mountain air. I retrieved my phone and ordered a private car to take me directly to the regional airport. I left them standing in the service hallway, surrounded by their own manufactured crisis. They would have to face the furious resort director alone. They would have to figure out how to pay the massive yacht bill with empty wallets. The opening skirmish was over. The declaration of war had been silently delivered. I sat in the back of the black town car as it sped away from the glittering lights of Aspen, my mind already designing a digital labyrinth that would trap Marcus long before sunrise. I landed in New York hours before dawn. The transition from the freezing Aspen air to the climate-controlled hum of my corner office in Manhattan felt like returning to an armored fortress. The extortion attempt hanging over my head operated like a ticking clock. Chloe promised to email the compliance board by sunrise. I had less than 4 hours to neutralize their leverage and dismantle their safety net. I booted up my primary workstation. The monitors cast a sterile white light across the empty room. I needed to anticipate Marcus and his next maneuver. He was cornered, drowning in a margin call and desperate for immediate liquid capital. A man facing imminent financial ruin does not simply accept defeat. He searches for a hidden shortcut. I knew how Marcus operated. He possessed a fundamental lack of boundaries, combined with a dangerous amount of technical literacy. Months ago, during a brief family dinner, I caught him examining Chloe and her unlocked smartphone while she was in the kitchen. A quick glance at the active background applications on her screen revealed he had installed a commercial spyware tracker on her device. He monitored her texts, her location, and her banking applications to maintain strict surveillance over her movements. He was a digital scavenger, always hunting for an unguarded backdoor. Now that my corporate affiliation was the focal point of their survival strategy, I knew exactly where he would point his scavenger's nose. At 3:45 in the morning, my secondary monitor flared to life. The proprietary security dashboard for our mergers and acquisitions server registered a critical anomaly. A series of brute force login attempts were pinging our external firewall. Someone was trying to breach the secure employee portal. I traced the origin of the incoming requests. The geographic coordinates pointed directly to the resort network in Aspen. Marcus was awake, pacing his hotel room, trying to force his way into my professional life. He wanted insider information. In the high-stakes environment of Wall Street, gaining advanced knowledge of a corporate merger is the equivalent of holding tomorrow-winning lottery numbers. He intended to execute illegal stock trades based on stolen data to generate the cash he needed to save his sinking crypto fund. The standard security protocol required me to instantly sever the connection and block the intruder. Doing so would protect the firm, but it would leave Marcus free to pursue his extortion plot. I overrode the automated defense system. I needed him to step deep inside the house so I could lock the door behind him. I initiated a specialized countermeasure known in cybersecurity as a honeypot. It is a decoy server designed to look identical to the primary database but entirely isolated from the actual corporate network. It functions as a digital sandbox, a mirrored cage built specifically to trap intruders. I needed bait irresistible enough to make him act recklessly. I rapidly drafted a synthetic financial dossier. I structured the documents to resemble a highly confidential acquisition file. The fake data detailed an impending multi-billion-dollar buyout of a prominent publicly traded medical technology group by a global pharmaceutical conglomerate. I inflated the projected share price, offering a guaranteed 400% return on any pre-market investments. I stamped the digital file with classified executive watermarks and embedded it deep within the decoy server directory. I lowered the firewall defenses just a fraction, allowing him to slip through the perimeter. I watched the live command log as Marcus penetrated the system. He navigated the fabricated directory with the frantic speed of a starving animal. He bypassed the generic employee memos and zeroed in straight on the restricted executive folders. He found the medical buyout file. I sat perfectly still, watching the progress bar on my screen. He initiated the download. The data transfer protocol required exactly 60 seconds to complete. During that single minute, he sealed his own fate. By pulling that file from a protected financial server, he triggered a hidden script I had embedded in the document metadata. The script did not just send him the fake information. It silently extracted his device, identifying markers, routing them straight to my secure ledger. The download reached 100%. The connection terminated. Marcus had his stolen lottery ticket. He likely believed he had just outsmarted a Wall Street executive. He was probably waking Chloe up right now, bragging about his imminent windfall. He had no idea the file he stole was worthless. More importantly, he failed to realize the digital footprint he left behind. My screen populated with the ultimate evidentiary package. I possessed his exact network location, the unalterable hardware address of his personal laptop, and a minute-by-minute keystroke log of his illegal intrusion. Marcus had escalated his behavior from simple credit card theft to severe corporate espionage. Engaging in insider trading using hacked data crossed a threshold that local police departments do not handle. This was strict jurisdiction for federal agencies. I compiled the digital fingerprints into an encrypted vault. The threat of Chloe calling my compliance board was now entirely neutralized. If she tried to accuse me of financial mismanagement, I held the undeniable proof that her husband was actively hacking the firm. The compliance officers would immediately hand the case over to the authorities. The blackmail scheme was dead. Neutralizing their leverage was only a defensive maneuver. I needed an offensive strike to dismantle the core of their arrogance. I shifted my focus from the cyber intrusion back to the root of their panic, the mortgage. Richard had casually confessed in the hallway that they leveraged the family estate through a secondary lending institution named Apex Capital. They borrowed against their home to fund a scam. I opened the global asset registry for my own firm. The digital breadcrumbs from the Honeypot were secure, but the true weapon rested in the fine print of that loan agreement. Catching a thief on a server is satisfying, but controlling the roof over his head provides absolute leverage. I typed Apex Capital into the search bar, preparing to trace the debt structure. The search results illuminated my office, indicating a stunning corporate coincidence that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. The search query returned a single highly detailed corporate profile, Apex Capital. The name sounded benign on the surface, but any seasoned financial analyst recognized it instantly as a predatory shadow bank. They specialized in subprime mezzanine debt. They targeted desperate individuals who had exhausted their traditional credit lines, providing high-interest loans secured against hard assets. Richard always boasted about his impeccable credit score at family dinners, claiming traditional banks begged for his business. The reality glowing on my screen told a different story. His traditional credit was tapped out. He had driven his financial profile into the ground trying to fund Patricia and her country club memberships. When Marcus pitched his fraudulent crypto hedge fund, Richard could not secure a standard bank loan. I was forced to crawl to bottom-feeding lenders like Apex, signing away the equity of the family estate at extortionate interest rates just to secure the cash. Catching Marcus committing corporate espionage provided the defensive shield I needed to protect my career. True power, however, is not merely deflecting an attack. True power is stripping the enemy of their foundation. Staring at the Apex Capital profile, a cold, profound sense of alignment settled over me. The financial universe operates on ruthless efficiency, and sometimes it delivers a flawless execution vector right into your hands. My firm specializes in hostile takeovers and aggressive corporate restructuring. For the past 8 months, I had been the lead architect on a multi-billion-dollar acquisition campaign targeting a sprawling financial conglomerate named Zenith Holdings. Zenith was the parent company that owned and operated Apex Capital. The timing was a masterpiece of corporate synergy. The final regulatory approval for the Zenith acquisition had cleared the federal desk 48 hours ago. This morning at 9 o'clock, the market would open, and the ink on the final merger agreements would dry. My firm would absorb Zenith and all its subsidiaries. As the incoming managing partner overseeing the transition, I possessed unilateral authority over the restructuring of their distressed asset portfolios. I did not need to wait for a judge or a prolonged legal battle to address the extortion attempt from my parents. I already owned the battlefield. The sun began to rise over the East River, casting a sharp golden light across the Manhattan skyline. The transition from night to morning brought the bustling energy of Wall Street to life outside my window. Inside my office, the silence remained unbroken. I summoned the chief legal counsel for the integration team. A sharp, meticulous attorney named David entered my office carrying a stack of digital integration manifests. I instructed him to carve out a highly specific localized debt portfolio from the Apex Capital acquisition ledger. I provided the exact residential address of my parents' estate in Atlanta. I directed David to transfer the corresponding mortgage note away from the primary corporate holdings and assign it directly to a private shell entity registered in Delaware. The entity was an anonymous holding company I established years prior for discrete property acquisitions. By routing the mortgage into this shell, I masked my identity from the public registry while retaining total control over the debt instrument. David did not ask questions. In our industry, moving distressed paper between corporate umbrellas is a routine procedure. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the legal maneuvering was complete. The transaction processed silently through the internal banking network. I was no longer just a discarded daughter. I was the primary lien holder on the only asset my parents had left. Owning the debt was only the first step. Executing a foreclosure requires a legal catalyst. I opened the digitized copy of the mortgage contract Richard had signed with Apex. Subprime lenders build their contracts like bear traps, burying lethal clauses deep within pages of dense legal jargon to ensure they can seize collateral at the slightest infraction. I bypassed the standard payment schedules and scrolled directly to the covenants section. My eyes scanned the text, hunting for the structural flaw. I found it buried in Section 4. It was a standard compliance mandate regarding the lawful use of funds. The clause explicitly prohibited the borrower from transferring the loan principal into unregulated speculative investments or unregistered financial vehicles. Richard had taken the mortgage disbursement and wired it directly into the crypto staking platform managed by Marcus. Cryptocurrencies and unregistered hedge funds are the exact definition of unregulated speculative investments. Marcus did not hold a single valid securities license. The transfer was a blatant, undeniable breach of the core lending covenant. Furthermore, Marcus was currently under federal scrutiny thanks to the digital fingerprints I captured during his hack. Pumping home equity into a fraudulent enterprise to cover margin calls triggered an immediate default status. I highlighted the breach of contract clause on my monitor. The legal remedy for this specific violation was harsh and instantaneous. The contract granted the creditor the right to invoke an acceleration clause, demanding the prompt repayment of the entire loan balance. Failure to produce the total sum within hours allowed the creditor to bypass standard grace periods and initiate an expedited foreclosure. Richard and Patricia had spent their entire lives treating me like a safety net they could trample on. They believed their home was an untouchable fortress. They had no idea they had handed the keys to their destruction to the very person they tried to extort. I generated the formal notice of default. I attached the wire transfer logs proving the funds were routed to the illegal crypto scheme. I drafted the acceleration demand, utilizing the aggressive legal templates my firm employed for hostile asset seizures. I formatted the document, ensuring every legal requirement was met to mandate an immediate physical eviction upon non-payment. I sent the file to a specialized process server holding the delivery order in escrow until I gave the final command. The weapon was loaded and aimed directly at their front door. While I secured the legal right to render them homeless, Marcus was busy operating under a fatal delusion. He woke up in Aspen believing the fake medical merger file he stole from my Honeypot server was authentic. He thought he possessed insider knowledge worth millions. A rational man would quietly execute the trades and fade into the background. Marcus, however, was a creature driven by ego and a desperate need for public validation. He needed fresh capital to execute the trades, and he needed an audience to witness his fabricated genius. My intelligence feeds indicated he was organizing a lavish emergency gala in Manhattan for the following evening. He rented out a premium ballroom, inviting a network of naive angel investors to pitch them on a revolutionary new trading algorithm. He planned to use the stolen data to lure them into signing massive checks. Patricia and Richard were flying into the city to attend, playing the role of wealthy benefactors to help him secure the marks. They were walking blindly onto a stage built on stolen money and federal crimes. I closed out of my financial terminals and reached for the garment bag hanging behind my desk. I needed to select the right suit for a charity gala. It was time to accept their unstated invitation. The venue Marcus selected for his desperate fundraising gala was a historic ballroom situated in the heart of Manhattan. The architecture featured soaring vaulted ceilings, imported marble columns, and enormous crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, affluent glow over the guests. The heavy mahogany doors at the entrance were manned by imposing private security contractors, reinforcing the illusion of extreme exclusivity. To an outsider, it looked like a gathering of the financial elite, celebrating a groundbreaking innovation. To my trained eye, it was a glossy, shimmering stage built entirely on a foundation of art. Marcus spared no expense for this performance. He utilized the remaining scraps of the credit he had managed to secure through high-interest microloans to finance the open bars and the gourmet catering. He wore a sharply cut midnight blue tuxedo that emphasized his commanding presence. He moved through the crowd of potential investors with the fluid, practiced grace of a seasoned con artist. He shook hands, laughed loudly, and spoke in rapid, confident bursts about decentralization, market disruptions, and unparalleled returns. He operated with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he held a winning hand, completely unaware that the deck was thoroughly rigged. He had gathered roughly 60 angel investors, high net worth individuals, looking for the next lucrative tech opportunity. They were captivated by his charisma and the aggressive, confident pitch he delivered. They did not see the desperation hiding behind his bright smile. They saw a visionary leader who promised to multiply their capital within weeks. They were sipping expensive champagne, preparing their checkbooks to fund a black hole. Patricia and Richard held court at the primary VIP table, positioned directly adjacent to the main stage. They basked in the reflected glory of their golden son-in-law. Patricia wore a shimmering silver gown, her neck adorned with an ostentatious diamond necklace she had likely leased for the evening to maintain appearances. She leaned across the table, engaging a prominent real estate developer in conversation. She projected her voice, ensuring the surrounding tables heard her boasts. She praised Marcus and his unparalleled financial acumen, painting him as a prodigy who single-handedly secured their family legacy. She pointedly avoided mentioning how their family estate was currently leveraged to the hilt to support his failing enterprise. Richard sat beside her, nodding sagely, swirling his bourbon, and projecting the image of a wise patriarch surveying his empire. Chloe stood near the podium, acting as the glamorous hostess. She wore a stunning crimson haute couture gown, the fabric draped flawlessly over her frame, a testament to elite design and exorbitant pricing. I recognized the label instantly. It was a recent runway piece that retailed for nearly $20,000. A piece undoubtedly purchased using the corporate credit card she had systematically drained before I initiated the total freeze. She clutched a sleek tablet displaying the presentation metrics, nodding encouragingly as Marcus worked the room. She was the perfect accessory to his fraud, providing visual validation of his supposed success. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The attendees finished their main courses and directed their attention toward the stage as the ambient lighting dimmed. A single bright spotlight illuminated the podium. Marcus stepped up, adjusting the microphone with a smooth, confident gesture. The room fell silent, waiting for the revelation that would guarantee their future wealth. He cleared his throat, looking out over the sea of eager faces. He began his keynote speech, weaving a complex narrative about market stagnation and the urgent necessity for aggressive algorithmic trading. He used dense financial jargon designed to sound sophisticated while conveying absolutely nothing of substance. He claimed his firm had developed a proprietary predictive model capable of anticipating major corporate restructuring before the public markets reacted. He was laying the groundwork, preparing to unveil the fake medical merger data he had stolen from my Honeypot server. He intended to present it as a flawless demonstration of his system's predictive power, a guaranteed home run that would force the investors to open their wallets. He raised his hand, gesturing toward the massive LED screen positioned behind him. He promised a live demonstration of the algorithm in action, an exclusive look at the future of finance. The investors leaned forward, captivated by the performance. Patricia smiled triumphantly, resting her hand on Richard's arm. Chloe beamed from the sidelines. The silence in the grand ballroom was sudden and absolute as Marcus paused for dramatic effect. He waited for the digital display to illuminate the fake data. The tension was palpable. The trap was primed. He took a deep breath, ready to deliver the killing blow to his victims' bank accounts. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the ballroom did not open quietly. They did not creak or slowly swing ajar. They were thrust inward with a violent concussive force that shattered the hushed atmosphere of the gala. The heavy wood slammed against the marble walls, echoing like a gunshot across the cavernous room. The sudden jarring noise startled the guests, causing several investors to spill their drinks in shock. Heads whipped around, tearing their attention away from the stage to focus on the disruption at the entrance. The private security contractors stationed at the doors stepped forward, instinctively reaching for their earpieces to handle the breach. They stopped dead in their tracks the moment they registered the nature of the intrusion. I stood framed in the massive doorway, silhouetted against the bright hallway lights. I did not wear an evening gown. I wore a tailored slate gray business suit, the armor of my profession. I did not carry an invitation. I carried the authority of a predator returning to claim its territory. I stepped over the threshold, the sharp click of my heels cutting through the stunned silence. I did not enter the room alone. The spectacle of my arrival was not merely a family confrontation. It was a highly orchestrated federal intervention. Flanking my left side was Julian, the cousin, whose wedding had served as the opening battlefield. He stood tall, his face set in a grim mask of determination, abandoning any remaining loyalty to his extended family. To my right walked Maya, his new bride. She had discarded the elegant white wedding dress for a stark, functional navy blazer. Maya moved with the undeniable presence of a woman who wielded the power of the state. She was not just a beautiful bride. She was an active, formidable federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime and major financial fraud. The presence of a federal prosecutor is intimidating, but it was the silent phalanx of individuals marching closely behind us that drained the oxygen from the room. 6 men and women wearing unassuming dark suits and severe expressions fanned out, taking strategic positions near the exits. The subtle glint of gold badges clipped to their belts and the distinct bulges of holstered weapons under their jackets identified them immediately. They were special agents assigned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division. The glittering illusion of the charity gala evaporated in an instant. The room transformed from a celebration of wealth into an active crime scene. The wealthy investors recognized the stark reality of federal law enforcement shutting down an event. Panic rippled through the crowd as individuals instinctively backed away from the stage, distancing themselves from the impending fallout. Patricia shot up from her VIP chair, the color vanishing from her cheeks. She pointed a trembling manicured finger toward the entrance, her voice cracking as she attempted to assert control. She screeched, demanding security, "Remove me from the premises," claiming I was an unstable, disgruntled relative, trying to ruin her son-in-law's business launch. Richard stood beside her, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between the federal agents and the exit doors, realizing the trap had closed. I ignored her completely. I did not raise my voice or engage in a shouting match. I maintained a steady, predatory pace, walking directly down the center aisle of the ballroom toward the stage. Marcus stood frozen behind the podium. The microphone slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the wooden stand. The confident visionary facade shattered, exposing the terrified grifter hiding underneath. He stared at me, the realization dawning that the Honeypot server, the stolen data, and the impending margin calls were not random misfortunes. They were precisely engineered weapons directed entirely by my hand. The execution was imminent, and the entire room was about to watch his destruction broadcast in high definition. The private security team hired to guard the mahogany doors snapped out of their initial shock. Two large men wearing dark tailored suits stepped forward, moving to intercept my path. Their faces were set in grim lines of professional duty. They reached into their jackets, preparing to physically escort me out of the venue and restore order for their paying client. Before they could close the distance, Maya stepped slightly ahead of me. She did not raise her voice. She did not draw a weapon or make a sudden threatening gesture. She simply reached into the interior pocket of her navy blazer and withdrew a slim leather wallet. She flipped the wallet open with a sharp flick of her wrist. The bright gold shield of the United States Department of Justice caught the glare of the crystal chandeliers. Maya held the gaze of the lead security contractor with the unshakable confidence of a woman who routinely dismantled corporate empires. She introduced herself as a federal prosecutor for the Southern District, specializing in white-collar syndicates and corporate fraud. She advised the guards to step back immediately unless they wished to be charged with obstructing an active federal investigation. The security contractors froze in place. Their training kicked in, overriding their payroll obligations. They recognized the hierarchy of power and the severe legal consequences of interfering with a federal badge. They slowly raised their hands and retreated to the walls, abandoning Marcus to his fate. The elite attendees watched the exchange unfold in breathless silence. The realization rippled through the ballroom like a physical chill, altering the very atmosphere of the gala. These were seasoned angel investors and individuals who survived on Wall Street by reading the room. They understood that federal badges at a fundraising event meant one thing: the host was an active criminal target. Men in expensive tuxedos subtly placed their checkbooks back into their interior pockets. Women stepped away from the main stage, creating a wide berth of empty space. The invisible perimeter around Marcus widened, isolating him on his own platform. The scent of expensive catering and designer perfume was swiftly replaced by the undeniable stench of fear. Patricia could not process the structural collapse of her reality. Her mind, conditioned to control every narrative through sheer manipulation, defaulted to its oldest defense mechanism. She pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the marble floor, drawing even more unwanted attention to the VIP table. She stood up, smoothing her leased silver gown, and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. She raised her voice, attempting to project maternal distress to the wealthy onlookers. She cried out, asking the crowd to ignore the disruption. She claimed I was suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. She spun a frantic, unhinged tale, declaring that I harbored a deep, unnatural jealousy of my sister Chloe and her successful husband. She pleaded with the investors to understand that I was a bitter, isolated woman trying to sabotage a brilliant tech launch out of pure spite. She dropped names of prominent country clubs and invoked fake societal pedigrees, desperately hoping her fabricated status would compel the crowd to side with her against the federal authorities. Richard stood beside her, nodding vigorously. He tried to puff out his chest and physically block the path between me and the stage. He utilized his booming patriarchal voice ordering Julian to take me outside and handle the embarrassment. He treated his nephew like an errand boy, failing to realize the dynamics had permanently shifted. Julian simply stared back at his uncle, his expression carved from stone. Julian had watched my parents belittle me at his own wedding reception. He had watched them praise a grifter while I paid their bills. The familial loyalty had vanished entirely, replaced by a cold demand for justice. Chloe remained near the edge of the stage. The stunning haute couture gown suddenly looked like a prison uniform. Her eyes darted from the federal agents to her husband and then to me. Her survival instincts kicked in. Instead of rushing to defend the man she claimed to love, she took a subtle step backward, distancing herself from the podium. She recognized a sinking ship and was already looking for a life raft. I did not break my stride. I did not dignify Patricia and her frantic performance with a verbal response. Engaging with a narcissist only serves to validate their illusion. I treated her like empty space. I walked past the VIP table, leaving her screaming into the void. Her voice cracked. Her theatrical tears failed to generate a single ounce of sympathy from the hardened financial veterans surrounding her. The investors were looking at the federal agents securing the exits, not the weeping mother in the silver dress. Marcus remained paralyzed behind the podium. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edges of the wooden stand. He glanced nervously at the giant LED screen displaying his fake growth projections, desperately hoping his technological props would shield him. He was relying on the stolen medical merger data to save his life. He planned to unveil the stolen files to prove his algorithm worked and trick the room into funding his escape. He failed to comprehend that the stolen file was a digital Trojan horse. When he downloaded that Honeypot dossier from my secure server earlier that morning, the file executed a silent background script. The script mapped his personal device, securing a permanent backdoor into his operating system. He had plugged that same infected laptop directly into the ballroom audiovisual network to run his presentation. He literally handed me the remote control to his own execution. I stopped 5 feet from the edge of the stage. The federal agents fanned out, forming an impenetrable barrier across the rear of the hall. Julian stood firmly to my left, watching the brother-in-law he once tolerated crumble under intense pressure. I reached into the breast pocket of my slate gray suit. I withdrew my encrypted smartphone. The dark screen illuminated my face, reflecting in my eyes. I opened the custom command terminal I had built during the flight from Aspen. Patricia took a deep breath, preparing to launch into another hysterical tirade. She opened her mouth to shout a final desperate accusation. Before a single syllable could escape her lips, I tapped the execution icon on my screen. The command transmitted instantly through the local network, bypassing the venue firewalls, using the credentials Marcus had unknowingly provided. The effect was immediate and visually jarring. The massive LED screen behind the podium glitched. The vibrant colors of Marcus and his fake crypto charts distorted into a jagged pattern of pixelated static. A loud, high-pitched frequency whined through the ballroom speakers, causing several guests in the front row to flinch and cover their ears. The digital noise lasted for exactly 3 seconds. Then the screen went entirely black. The sudden loss of the bright presentation plunged the stage into heavy shadows. Marcus looked over his shoulder, his panic escalating as his visual aids vanished. He tapped the spacebar on his laptop, frantically trying to wake the system. The machine was dead, locked behind a terminal wall he could not breach. The darkness lasted only a moment. The giant screen flared back to life. It did not display the warm, inviting tones of a startup pitch. It emitted a harsh, stark, clinical white glare that washed over the entire ballroom. The light was unforgiving. It stripped away the romance of the gala, casting deep, unflattering shadows across the faces of my family. The stage was set for the final judgment, and Marcus had nowhere left to hide. The stark white glow from the hijacked LED screen illuminated the dust motes dancing in the silent air of the ballroom. The wealthy investors standing near the center of the hall adjusted their posture, leaning forward in an attempt to decipher the sudden visual disruption. They expected to see technical difficulties or perhaps a poorly executed marketing video. Instead, the giant display populated with a massive high-resolution spreadsheet. The rows and columns were stripped of all graphic design, relying entirely on the cold, hard reality of raw financial data. I did not need to speak. I let the numbers do the talking. The first document I projected was a comprehensive banking ledger. It detailed the exact flow of liquid capital into Marcus and his supposed hedge fund over the previous 6 months. The investors in the room were seasoned veterans of Wall Street. Their trained eyes quickly scanned the glowing text, hunting for the origin of his seed money. They expected to see legitimate venture capital backing, or perhaps a syndicate of early angel investors. The truth displayed on the screen was a glaring red flag that shattered his entire narrative. The ledger clearly showed zero legitimate institutional backing. Every single incoming wire transfer originated from a solitary corporate credit line. The authorized user profile attached to those transfers flashed prominently on the screen, displaying the name Patricia Montgomery. My mother let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest, as her complicity in the theft was broadcast to the entire room. The guests murmured, their voices rising in a wave of sudden chaotic realization. They were watching a self-proclaimed tech visionary operate a multi-million-dollar fund using a stolen family credit card, like a teenager stealing cash from a purse. The screen scrolled automatically, moving past the initial deposits to focus on the destination accounts. Marcus had spent the last hour convincing the room that he utilized a highly sophisticated proprietary trading algorithm. He claimed he capitalized on micro-fluctuations in decentralized finance markets. The documents on the screen proved his algorithm was nothing more than a digital illusion. I highlighted the outgoing wire transfers. He was not buying digital assets or investing in emerging technologies. The funds were routed through a convoluted web of shell companies. $300,000 of stolen corporate capital ping-ponged across a dozen domestic accounts before finally landing in a dormant holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, a holding company that listed Marcus as the sole beneficiary. It was not a hedge fund. It was a classic offshore embezzlement scheme. The investors realized in real time that if they had written a check tonight, their money would have vanished into the exact same Caribbean black hole. Marcus frantically pounded the keys on his laptop, his face slick with sweat. He tried to override the visual feed, muttering curses under his breath. He yanked the HDMI cable out of the side of his machine, hoping to physically sever the connection. The screen did not even flicker. My script operated independently, overriding the local hardware and pulling the feed directly from the venue network server. He was entirely locked out of his own presentation. I stood near the edge of the stage, offering zero pity for the man squirming under the intense public scrutiny. Providing bank statements exposed the financial rot, but I needed to dismantle the core of his personal arrogance. I needed the room to see the pathetic reality of the man hiding inside the bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. I swiped my thumb across my phone, transitioning to the next phase of the digital execution. The spreadsheet faded, replacing the data with a grainy, high-definition video feed. The timestamp burned into the corner of the footage, indicated it was recorded less than 48 hours ago. The location was not a sleek corporate office or a high-end luxury boutique. It was a dingy, heavily barred pawn shop located deep in the garment district. The camera angled downward, capturing the interaction across a scratched glass counter. The man standing at the counter was undeniably Marcus. He was not wearing a tailored suit. He wore a hooded sweatshirt, his face hidden behind large sunglasses, darting nervous glances toward the exit. The audio crackled to life, filling the silent ballroom with the desperate haggling of a cornered addict. The investors watched as Marcus unclipped a heavy platinum watch from his wrist. It was the exact same luxury timepiece he had flashed at the wedding reception in Aspen. The watch my parents had proudly claimed was a symbol of his trading success. The watch he purchased using stolen money from my corporate account. He shoved the timepiece across the counter, demanding $30,000 in untraceable cash. The pawnbroker examined the watch through a jeweler loop, laughing harshly at the demand. The broker offered $12,000, explaining the secondary market was currently flooded. Marcus did not negotiate. He did not walk away. He grabbed the stacks of $100 bills, stuffing them frantically into a duffel bag. The audio captured his final, pathetic exchange. He begged the broker not to log the transaction, claiming he needed to pay off a private associate by midnight to avoid a physical altercation. The video feed cut out, plunging the room back into the stark white glare of the data terminal. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, deafening, and profound. The brilliant hedge fund manager had just been exposed as a desperate man, pawning stolen jewelry to pay off loan sharks. The facade was completely, utterly obliterated. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with horror as the reality of her husband crashed down around her. She had willingly ignored his red flags, enjoying the designer clothes and the expensive dinners. She had played the role of the devoted wife while he systematically drained my accounts. Now she was standing in front of the New York elite, tethered to a common street-level grifter. She took another step backward, shrinking away from the podium. Marcus stood frozen in the center of the stage. He looked out at the sea of disgusted faces. The investors who had treated him with reverence an hour ago now viewed him with overt contempt. Several men in the front row actively turned their backs to the stage, refusing to even look at him. He realized his reputation was dead. He could never show his face in a financial district again. He opened his mouth, grasping for a final desperate lie to salvage the situation. He gripped the microphone, intending to spin a story about deep fakes and corporate sabotage. Before a single word could materialize, I delivered the final devastating blow. I advanced the presentation to the last slide. The screen filled with lines of dense, complex computer code. To the average person, it looked like random text. To the seasoned financial and tech investors in the room, it was a glaring, undeniable confession of a severe federal crime. It was the command line log from the Honeypot server I had deployed the previous night. The log highlighted the specific IP address traced directly to his laptop. It detailed the exact second he bypassed the decoy firewall and downloaded the fabricated medical merger file. The text boldly labeled the action as unauthorized access of a protected corporate network. It was the digital fingerprint of espionage. The microphone slipped from his trembling hand. It hit the wooden floor of the stage with a sharp, loud crack, emitting a piercing screech of feedback that forced several guests to cover their ears. Marcus did not attempt to pick it up. He stared blankly at the code on the screen, realizing the trap had closed perfectly around his neck. He looked down at me, standing calmly below the stage. The arrogant smirk, the smooth-talking confidence, the manipulative charm, it was all gone. He looked like a hollow shell standing in a puddle of his own ruin. The final layer of his defense had evaporated. The room understood exactly who he was, and more importantly, they understood exactly what was about to happen next. I lowered my phone, slipping it back into my jacket pocket. The visual presentation was concluded. The digital execution was complete. It was time for the physical extraction. The shrill screech of the dropped microphone echoed against the vaulted ceilings, fading slowly into a heavy, suffocating silence. Marcus stared at the command code projected behind him, fully comprehending that his digital intrusion had been monitored and recorded from the very first keystroke. He had played a dangerous game of corporate espionage, and I had handed the evidence directly to the authorities. The illusion of the sophisticated hedge fund manager was dead. He was now just an exposed criminal standing on a brightly lit stage with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Maya did not hesitate. She had allowed the digital presentation to run its course, providing the necessary context for the investors in the room. Now it was time to execute her mandate. She stepped forward, moving past me, and ascended the short flight of stairs to the main stage. Her navy blazer shifted slightly, revealing the gold federal badge clipped securely to her belt. The murmuring crowd parted instinctively, granting her a clear path. She moved with the fluid, purposeful stride of a seasoned prosecutor, closing a watertight case. She stopped exactly 3 feet from Marcus. She did not raise her voice to match the dramatic tension of the room. She spoke with a calm, chilling precision that carried effortlessly over the stunned audience. She addressed him by his full legal name, stripping away the casual moniker he used to charm his victims. She informed him that he was officially under arrest. She listed the charges with rapid, brutal efficiency: securities fraud, wire fraud, interstate money laundering, federal economic espionage. The list of felonies landed like physical blows. The investors in the front row took collective steps backward, physically distancing themselves from the toxic fallout of his impending indictment. Marcus looked at Maya, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate panic. The smooth-talking grifter was entirely out of script. He realized the woman standing before him was not just a guest at a wedding. She was the architect of his physical ruin. He glanced quickly toward the rear exit, located just behind the heavy velvet curtains outlining the stage. The survival instinct of a cornered animal overrode whatever remaining logic he possessed. He believed he could slip through the service corridor and vanish into the Manhattan night before the federal agents could mobilize. He turned on his heel, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished wood floor, and bolted toward the heavy curtains. He never even made it to the edge of the stage. The federal intervention was not limited to the agents standing by the main doors. Maya was a veteran prosecutor who anticipated flight risks. Throughout the evening, 4 specialized agents had blended seamlessly into the environment. They wore pristine white catering jackets carrying silver trays and serving champagne to the wealthy guests. They had positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter of the podium, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The moment Marcus lunged toward the exit, the 4 catering waiters dropped their silver trays. The crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor, causing several guests to scream in sudden terror. The agents shed their white jackets, revealing the tactical holsters and dark clothing beneath. They moved with terrifying synchronized speed. 2 agents vaulted directly onto the stage, cutting off his escape route. Marcus panicked wildly, swinging his arms in a blind attempt to push past them. He was not a trained fighter. He was a coward accustomed to hiding behind digital firewalls and stolen money. The lead agent did not bother drawing a weapon. He simply stepped inside the frantic swing, grabbed Marcus firmly by the lapels of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, and utilized his momentum against him. The agent executed a flawless tactical takedown, sweeping the legs out from under the fleeing suspect. Marcus crashed heavily onto the hard stage floor, the impact forcing the air from his lungs in a loud, breathless grunt. The second agent immediately dropped his weight onto the center of his back, pinning him securely against the polished wood. The quick, sharp ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoed over the chaotic gasps of the audience. They wrenched his arms backward, locking the cuffs tightly over the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. The pristine charity gala devolved into absolute mayhem. The sophisticated facade of the evening cracked entirely. The wealthy angel investors who just minutes ago had been captivated by his charming pitch now erupted in furious outrage. They realized they had narrowly avoided dumping millions of dollars into a criminal sinkhole. A prominent real estate developer standing near the front row angrily tore a pre-written check in half, throwing the pieces onto the floor in disgust. The room buzzed with the frantic energy of high-net-worth individuals, realizing they had been played for fools. Chloe stood frozen near the edge of the stage, watching her husband being forcefully restrained by federal agents. The reality of the situation crashed through her meticulously constructed delusions. The designer clothes, the luxury vacations, the status she paraded in front of her friends were all funded by a man currently face down on the floor, facing decades in federal prison. The comfortable parasitic life she enjoyed was over. Her shock rapidly mutated into a blind, hysterical rage. She refused to accept the undeniable evidence projected on the massive screen. She refused to believe the man she married was a fraud. She targeted the only narrative that allowed her to maintain her victimhood. She blamed the authorities. She blamed me. Chloe let out a piercing, guttural shriek that cut through the noise of the ballroom. She lifted the hem of her $20,000 haute couture gown and sprinted directly toward the stage. She did not aim for me. She charged blindly at the federal agents currently pulling Marcus to his feet. She swung her manicured hands wildly, clawing at the tactical vest of the nearest agent, screaming that they were making a terrible mistake. She demanded they release her billionaire husband instantly. Her interference was a profound, catastrophic miscalculation. The agents operating in an active takedown scenario do not tolerate physical obstruction, regardless of the suspect's attire or social standing. 2 female agents stationed near the front row reacted immediately. They moved swiftly, intercepting Chloe before she could inflict any actual damage. They grabbed her flailing arms, twisting them firmly behind her back with practiced efficiency. Chloe shrieked, thrashing violently against their grip, kicking her designer heels against their shins. Her resistance only escalated the severity of the response. The agents marched her forcefully backward, driving her shoulders hard against the nearby marble column to neutralize her movements. They secured her wrists with a heavy set of zip ties, ignoring her frantic sobs. Maya stepped over to the restrained woman, her expression devoid of any sympathy. She informed Chloe that she was officially detained for physically assaulting a federal officer and actively interfering with a lawful arrest. She advised her to remain silent unless she wished to add accessory to wire fraud to her growing list of immediate problems. Chloe slumped against the cold marble, her hysterical screams dissolving into pathetic, defeated whimpers. The glamorous hostess was now just another detained suspect, her expensive gown wrinkled and her reputation completely annihilated. The primary targets were secured. The federal agents began reading the Miranda rights to Marcus, hauling him roughly off the stage. They marched him through the center aisle, the very same path I had taken minutes earlier. The investors parted silently, watching the disgraced hedge fund manager take his final humiliating walk through high society. The chaos of the arrests left a heavy, thick tension hanging over the remaining family members. Patricia remained anchored to her chair at the VIP table, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction. Richard, however, was not ready to surrender. He possessed a deeply ingrained arrogance, a belief that his status as the patriarch granted him the authority to command any situation, regardless of the facts. He watched his son-in-law dragged away in cuffs and his daughter restrained against a wall. The illusion of his control was shattered, and he desperately needed a target to focus his mounting panic. He turned his eyes toward me, standing calmly near the base of the empty stage. The true reckoning for the architect of this disaster was about to begin. The federal agents hauled Marcus through the heavy mahogany doors, the sharp metallic click of his handcuffs echoing over the stunned murmurs of the remaining guests. The investors began a rapid, uncoordinated exodus, rushing toward the coat check, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a federal raid. The grand ballroom, once a monument to false wealth, rapidly emptied, leaving behind a chaotic scene of discarded champagne flutes and shattered illusions. The air grew cold. Amidst the swirling confusion, Richard shoved his way past a lingering security guard. The patriarch of the family refused to accept his newly diminished reality. For decades, he had relied on bluster and intimidation to mask his profound financial incompetence. He believed volume equaled authority. He believed that if he shouted loudly enough, reality itself would simply bend to accommodate his demands. He stormed across the marble floor, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, pointing a rigid, accusatory finger directly at me. He closed the distance, stopping mere inches from where I stood beside Julian and Maya. He did not ask what had happened. He did not express shock over the detailed evidence of theft broadcast across the massive screens. He immediately resorted to issuing commands, treating me not as a highly successful Wall Street executive, but as the disobedient child he assumed he still controlled. He demanded I contact my legal department instantly. He ordered me to post whatever exorbitant bail the federal judge set for Marcus. He insisted I retract the stolen data logs and fabricate a story about a corporate misunderstanding to clear his son-in-law's name. He leaned forward, the scent of stale bourbon rolling off his breath. He threatened to disown me right there in the empty ballroom if I refused to clean up the mess I had created. He claimed I was destroying the family reputation over petty jealousy. I was entirely blind to the fact that the family reputation was a hollow, rotting structure he had personally helped dismantle. I did not flinch. I did not take a step backward. I let him finish his frantic, desperate tirade, allowing him to exhaust the last remaining fumes of his manufactured authority. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life belittling my achievements while praising the parasites feeding off his own home. He expected a negotiation. He expected me to cave under the familiar pressure of familial obligation. I maintained a steady predator-like calm. I reached into the sleek leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I did not pull out a phone to call my legal team. I withdrew a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound by a stark red band. I did not hand the papers to him gently. I drove the heavy file forward, slamming it firmly against his chest, forcing him to instinctively grab the documents to keep them from falling to the marble floor. I informed him his authority was officially revoked. My voice was low, even and sharp enough to cut glass. I told him he no longer possessed the power to issue commands to anyone, especially not to the person who now legally owned the ground he stood on. Richard looked down at the thick stack of paper. His eyes darted across the bold, aggressive font stamped across the cover page. The words, "Notice of Foreclosure," jumped out in stark, undeniable black ink. The confusion on his face slowly mutated into a cold, creeping dread. He flipped the cover page, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the dense legal text detailing the exact terms of his financial execution. I did not wait for him to process the jargon. I translated the legal death sentence into plain, unforgiving English. I reminded him of the hallway conversation in Aspen, where he foolishly confessed to leveraging his primary residence through Apex Capital to fund Marcus and his fraudulent crypto scheme. I explained that engaging in unregulated speculative investments using heavily leveraged collateral was a direct catastrophic violation of his mortgage covenants. I watched the realization hit him as I explained the final piece of the puzzle. I detailed the morning acquisition of Zenith Holdings, confirming that my firm had successfully absorbed the parent company of his predatory lender. I informed him that I personally ordered the restructuring of his specific distressed asset. I was no longer simply his daughter. I was the managing partner of the holding company that currently possessed the exclusive rights to his debt. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent pale. I did not offer a single ounce of pity. I outlined the immediate consequences of his profound stupidity. Because he willfully violated the core lending agreements, the standard grace periods were entirely nullified. The legal documents he held in his shaking hands authorized an expedited, immediate physical eviction. I delivered the final blow, ensuring the reality of his situation was crystal clear. I told him the family estate, the sprawling suburban mansion he used to project his fake wealthy status, was officially seized. I stated he and Patricia had exactly 12 hours to return to Atlanta and pack whatever personal belongings they could fit into their vehicles. At precisely 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the county sheriff's department would arrive to enforce the lockout, changing the locks and physically removing anyone left inside the property. Richard staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. The heavy legal file slipped from his grasp, scattering across the polished marble floor. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grab the edge of a nearby catering table to prevent a total collapse. He clutched his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the sheer magnitude of his ruin crashed down upon him. He had wagered his sanctuary on a grifter, and he had lost everything to the daughter he always deemed a disappointment. The towering, arrogant patriarch was gone. He was replaced by a broken, terrified old man, gasping for air in an empty ballroom, knowing he was hours away from complete homelessness. The foundation of his life was obliterated, leaving him with nothing but the devastating consequences of his own greed. But the destruction was not entirely contained to him. The shockwaves of the federal raid and the sudden asset seizure were about to ignite a vicious, desperate civil war among the remaining parasites left standing in the hall. The heavy mahogany doors at the rear of the hall swung open again, revealing a chaotic scrum of opportunistic journalists and aggressive paparazzi. The news of a high-profile federal raid at a prestigious Manhattan charity gala had leaked to the local press corps. They swarmed the entrance, their camera flashes erupting in a blinding strobe light assault, capturing the total, unscripted collapse of the Montgomery family. Chloe stood near the marble column where the female agents had previously restrained her. She watched her father grasping the catering table for support, fighting for breath. She saw the foreclosure documents scattered across the floor. The comfortable insulated bubble she had occupied her entire life popped with a violent, undeniable finality. She possessed no marketable skills, no independent income, and absolutely zero survival instincts. Her entire identity was tethered to the men who funded her existence, and both of those men were now thoroughly ruined. The shock rapidly mutated into a desperate, vicious survival tactic. Chloe refused to accept accountability for her role in the disaster. She required a scapegoat. She turned her hysterical fury entirely onto the man being frog-marched past the entrance by the federal agents. She lunged toward the heavy doors, breaking free from the lingering shock. She screamed a stream of vile insults at Marcus, her voice cracking with raw hysteria. She publicly blamed him for the entire catastrophe, accusing him of manipulating her, orchestrating the fraud alone, and deliberately destroying her pristine life. Marcus halted his forced march. The federal agents gripped his arms tightly, but they allowed him a brief moment to face his screaming wife. The charming facade of the devoted husband vanished, replaced by the snarling, cornered rat he truly was. If he was going down, he was absolutely determined to drag her into the abyss with him. He did not offer an apology or a plea for understanding. He fired back, launching a brutal verbal counterattack right in front of the flashing cameras. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with intense venom. He commanded her to stop playing the innocent victim. He announced loudly, ensuring the surrounding journalists captured every single word, that the extensive credit card fraud was not a solo operation. He publicly exposed her complicity. He revealed that Chloe was the one who initially suggested utilizing my corporate card. He detailed how she demanded he continue stealing the funds to maintain her lavish lifestyle, specifically highlighting the $20,000 haute couture gown she currently wore. He declared her an active co-conspirator in the theft, shattering her desperate attempt to distance herself from the crimes. The toxic alliance imploded spectacularly. They stood in the grand foyer, tearing each other apart, screaming vicious accusations as the camera shutters clicked relentlessly. The golden couple was reduced to a pair of desperate criminals turning state's evidence on one another before they even reached the precinct. The agents finally pushed Marcus through the glass exit doors, shoving him into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle, effectively ending the public brawl. Back inside the ballroom, the devastation reached its pathetic conclusion. Patricia watched her daughter screaming at her arrested husband, and her own husband clutching his chest over foreclosure documents. The matriarch, who had spent 40 years meticulously cultivating an image of untouchable suburban supremacy, finally broke. The sheer weight of the public humiliation and the impending homelessness crushed her completely. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor. The shimmering silver gown she had proudly worn to impress the New York elite soaked up a puddle of spilled red wine, staining the expensive fabric with a deep dark hue that looked remarkably like blood. She did not attempt to stand up. She abandoned every ounce of her manufactured dignity. She crawled across the floor, reaching out with trembling hands. Patricia grabbed the crisp hem of my tailored slate gray trousers. She looked up at me, her perfectly applied makeup ruined by heavy streaks of mascara and running tears. She begged. The woman who had proudly called me a disappointment just 48 hours ago was now weeping openly, clutching my leg and pleading for mercy. She promised they would change. She swore they would cut ties with Marcus. She desperately offered to sign whatever documents I required if I would just stop the foreclosure and let them keep the house. She asked me to remember that we were family. I looked down at the ruined woman grasping my trousers. I felt no satisfaction in her tears. I felt no lingering anger. I felt an absolute freezing detachment. I looked at the hands that had eagerly swiped my corporate card to fund a thief. I looked at the face that had sneered at me across countless dinner tables. I did not step backward. I did not attempt to pry her hands away from my suit. I stood perfectly still, allowing her to experience the full excruciating depth of her own pathetic surrender. I looked directly into her eyes and delivered the final judgment. I told her that a disappointment does not carry spare change for fraudsters. I kept my gaze fixed on her for one more agonizing second, ensuring the permanence of the rejection settled deep into her bones. Then I turned my body smoothly, breaking her weak grip on my clothing. I did not look back at Richard, still struggling to breathe near the table. I ignored Chloe, sobbing uncontrollably near the entrance. The familial ties were officially severed. I walked toward the rear exit alongside Julian and Maya. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind us, sealing the Montgomery family inside the tomb of their own making. We stepped out into the crisp, cool air of the Manhattan night, leaving the flashing cameras and the chaotic aftermath entirely behind. The immediate extraction was clean, but the true test of their survival was looming. The 12-hour countdown had officially begun, and the morning would bring a physical confrontation they could not manipulate their way out of. The morning sun cresting over the Atlanta suburbs offered no warmth to the three figures stepping out of the battered yellow taxi. The ride from the airport had been completed in heavy, suffocating silence. Richard, Patricia, and Chloe looked like casualties of a rapid, brutal war. The expensive evening wear from the Manhattan Gala was now deeply creased and smelled faintly of stale sweat and police precinct waiting rooms. They had spent the entire night answering questions from federal investigators regarding Marcus and his sprawling network of wire fraud. They were exhausted, humiliated, and desperately clinging to the single remaining comfort they thought they possessed: the family home. They expected to walk through the heavy oak doors, collapse into their custom beds, and hide from the public fallout. They believed the 12-hour eviction notice I handed Richard was an empty threat, a scare tactic designed to force an apology. They failed to comprehend that I did not issue threats. I executed corporate directives. The taxi sped away, leaving them standing at the base of their long, manicured driveway. The scene unfolding before them shattered their final delusion. The quiet, affluent suburban street was entirely dominated by heavy diesel engines. 6 massive commercial moving trucks were parked in a tight formation, occupying the entire circular driveway and spilling out onto the pristine curb. A coordinated team of 20 property management contractors moved with ruthless military efficiency. They were not wearing the polite uniforms of a high-end relocation service. They wore heavy work boots and high-visibility vests. They operated under a strict mandate: clear the asset entirely and secure the perimeter immediately. Patricia let out a strangled gasp, clutching her ruined silver gown. She watched a burly contractor march out the front door, carrying a stack of her designer handbags. He did not treat them with reverence. He tossed them unceremoniously into a large, cheap cardboard box resting on the tailgate of the nearest truck. The fake luxury goods collided with the cheap cardboard, a stark visual representation of her hollow status. Chloe sprinted up the driveway, her exhaustion overridden by a surge of pure panic. She screamed at the workers, demanding they drop her belongings. She attempted to grab a box containing her expensive shoes, but a supervisor immediately stepped into her path. He was a broad-shouldered man, holding a thick clipboard displaying the court-ordered eviction mandate. He did not engage in an argument. He pointed a thick finger toward the property line and bluntly informed her that she was currently trespassing on a seized corporate asset. He warned her that any further interference would result in immediate arrest. Richard staggered forward, his face a mask of profound disbelief. He bypassed the moving crew and focused entirely on the front entrance. A specialized commercial locksmith was currently kneeling by the heavy oak door. The high-pitched whine of an industrial drill pierced the morning air. The locksmith was aggressively boring straight through the complex smart lock system Richard had proudly installed the previous year. The expensive electronic mechanism shattered, falling to the stone porch in useless metallic pieces. The technician swiftly replaced the ruined hardware with a heavy-duty industrial steel deadbolt, essentially turning the suburban mansion into a fortified commercial vault. The physical destruction of his access point finalized his defeat. He could no longer enter the sanctuary he used to project his patriarchal authority. He stood frozen on the walkway, watching the contractors systematically strip his life bare. They hauled out the custom furniture, the flat-screen televisions, the expensive artwork, tossing everything into the waiting cavernous trucks. A second crew was busy in the front yard. They carried a heavy metal post and a large wooden sign painted in stark, unforgiving colors. They positioned it perfectly center on the meticulously manicured lawn. The rhythmic thud of a sledgehammer driving the post deep into the soil echoed loudly. The sign displayed bold block letters that could be easily read by any passing neighbor. Foreclosed property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The visual branding of their failure was complete. The neighborhood they had fiercely judged and attempted to dominate for decades was now witnessing their absolute public eviction. Curtains twitched in the houses across the street. Wealthy neighbors stepped out onto their porches holding cups of coffee, observing the spectacle with thinly veiled satisfaction. The Montgomery family was no longer part of the elite club. They were a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. Patricia dropped to her knees on the driveway, her hands covering her face. She sobbed loudly, unable to cope with the reality of standing on the street corner with absolutely nothing. Chloe paced frantically, pulling her dead cell phone from her clutch, repeatedly pressing the power button, trying to find someone, anyone who could offer her a lifeline. She was entirely cut off from the funds she had stolen and the husband who had enabled her. Richard simply stared at the red foreclosure sign. He had gambled his entire existence on the illusion of superior intelligence, and he had lost spectacularly. He was an aging, bankrupt man standing in wrinkled formal wear, watching a corporate entity erase his footprint from the earth. The property was secured, the assets were seized, the extraction was flawless. However, the financial execution was not entirely concluded. While they stood shivering on the sidewalk, mourning the loss of their physical home, a secondary algorithmic trap was silently closing around the last remaining scraps of their financial future. The final blade was preparing to drop. The rumble of the moving trucks shifting into gear provided a harsh mechanical soundtrack to the scene on the driveway. Richard remained anchored to the pavement, his eyes glazed over, watching the corporate contractors haul away the last remnants of his curated life. Patricia wept silently near the curb. Chloe furiously tapped her dead phone screen, refusing to accept her new reality. The visual destruction of their physical sanctuary was complete. The psychological toll was heavy, but the true financial execution required a final, devastating mechanism to trigger. A sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the morning air. It did not originate from Chloe and her dead battery. The sound came from the interior pocket of Richard's wrinkled suit jacket. He flinched instinctively, patting his chest. He fumbled with the fabric, pulling out his personal smartphone. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number bearing a Washington, D.C. area code. He answered the call, his voice raspy and defensive, demanding to know who was interrupting his crisis. I expected a harassing call from a creditor, or perhaps a local journalist, sniffing around for a quote following the spectacular Gala raid. The voice on the other end was neither. It was smooth, professional, and entirely devoid of empathy. It was Marcus's newly appointed federal defense attorney calling directly from a secure holding facility. The attorney did not waste time offering condolences regarding the arrest. He possessed a fiduciary duty to inform the immediate family of a catastrophic shift in their shared financial liability. He explained that he was currently reviewing the digital evidence seized by the FBI the night before. He needed to clarify the exact nature of the trading positions Marcus had executed right before the Gala. Richard listened, his brow furrowing in confusion. He muttered that he knew nothing about the specific trades, relying entirely on his son-in-law to manage the hedge fund. He reiterated his blind faith in the proprietary algorithm. The attorney's response cut through the lingering delusion with surgical precision. He bluntly informed Richard that there was no algorithm. Marcus had operated the entire fund based on a single stolen document. The attorney detailed the events of the previous dawn. He explained how Marcus believed he had successfully infiltrated my firm's secure servers. He outlined how Marcus downloaded what he thought was classified insider information regarding the imminent collapse of a major medical technology conglomerate. The stolen dossier predicted a catastrophic failure in their clinical trials, guaranteeing a massive plunge in their stock valuation upon the market opening. Acting on this stolen intelligence, Marcus executed a highly aggressive trading strategy. He did not buy shares, he shorted the stock. He borrowed heavily against the final remaining liquid assets in the hedge fund, including the last scraps of the mortgage capital Richard had provided. He placed a massive bet that the medical company would fail, expecting to reap astronomical profits when the share price cratered. The attorney paused, allowing the gravity of the short position to settle. He then delivered the fatal blow. He revealed that the dossier Marcus downloaded was entirely fabricated. It was a digital decoy, a honeypot trap explicitly designed to feed him false data. Richard's breathing hitched. He asked the attorney to explain the current market status. The attorney's voice grew grim. He stated that the medical technology conglomerate did not collapse. In fact, at exactly 9 o'clock that morning, they announced a revolutionary breakthrough in their research division. The stock did not plummet. It skyrocketed. The share price surged over 300% within the first hour of trading. The mechanics of short selling are inherently dangerous. When a trader bets against a stock and the price rises, the potential losses are mathematically infinite. Marcus had leveraged the fund to the absolute maximum limit. The 300% surge did not just wipe out the remaining balance of the hedge fund. It triggered an automatic catastrophic margin call across all his brokerage accounts. The attorney clarified the specific legal peril Richard now faced. When Richard wired the mortgage funds to Marcus, he did not simply act as a passive investor. To secure the aggressive trading accounts, Marcus required a guarantor, a co-signer, to absorb the risk. Richard, eager to prove his financial prowess and secure his piece of the imaginary profits, had willingly signed the guarantee documents. The resulting margin call did not stop at the empty borders of the crypto fund. The deficit cascaded upward, locking onto the guarantors. The attorney delivered the final terrifying number. The failed short position had generated a negative balance exceeding $50 million. Richard dropped the phone. The device hit the concrete driveway, cracking the screen. He did not attempt to pick it up. The attorney's voice continued to buzz faintly from the small speaker outlining the impending federal asset seizures, but Richard was no longer listening. He stared blankly at the red foreclosure sign planted in his former front yard. He finally understood the depth of the snare I had laid. I did not just lock his credit cards or seize his house. I had handed his greedy son-in-law the exact tool required to dig a financial grave so deep they could never climb out. By feeding Marcus the fake data, I weaponized his own illegal actions against him. The resulting $50 million margin call was an inescapable black hole. There was no legal maneuver capable of erasing that level of institutional debt. Bankruptcy protection does not shield individuals from liabilities incurred through federal fraud and insider trading. The debt would follow them forever. The government and the brokerage firms would garnish their wages, seize their pensions, and freeze any future bank accounts they attempted to open. Patricia, noticing her husband's sudden, terrifying silence, crawled over to the dropped phone. She listened to the attorney explain the $50 million deficit. She let out a hollow, breathless sound, falling back onto the pavement. The magnitude of the ruin was too vast to process. They had traded their daughter's loyalty for a parasitic illusion, and the illusion had just handed them a lifelong prison sentence of unyielding poverty. The trap had snapped entirely shut. The moving trucks finished loading the final boxes, pulling away from the curb and leaving the street eerily quiet. The three of them sat on the sidewalk entirely alone, facing a future devoid of wealth, status, or hope. The physical eviction was complete, but the true payload of my design, the inescapable algorithmic vengeance, was preparing to deliver its final undeniable consequence on the broader stage of Wall Street. The crushed smartphone on the driveway continued to broadcast the lawyer's bleak voice until the battery finally died, plunging the suburban sidewalk back into an eerie morning stillness. The true genius of a Wall Street takedown does not rely on shouting matches or dramatic courtroom theatrics. It relies on the predictable, robotic nature of human greed. Marcus had built his entire persona around the concept of automated algorithmic trading. He constantly boasted at family dinners about his proprietary bots, executing transactions faster than any human broker. I simply weaponized his own technology against him. When he breached my decoy server, he did not just read the fabricated medical merger file and manually call a broker to place a few cautious trades. He fed the counterfeit data parameters directly into his high-frequency trading software. The software functioned exactly as programmed, without a shred of human intuition or risk management. Detecting what it believed was a guaranteed plunge in the medical conglomerate's stock value, the bot initiated a sequence of relentless short sales. Shorting a stock requires borrowing shares, which demands heavy collateral. Marcus designed his algorithm to bypass safety protocols, utilizing a financial mechanism known as cross-margining. The software scraped the bottom of his failing crypto fund, drained the stolen credit lines, and most lethally tapped directly into the institutional brokerage accounts backed by my parents' signatures. The bot leveraged every available cent at a ratio of 20 to 1. It was a digital suicide mission executed in fractions of a second. When the opening bell rang and the stock price skyrocketed, instead of cratering, the algorithm attempted to cover the position, buying back the shares at an astronomical markup. The resulting deficit spiraled out of control before any failsafe could pull the plug. Financial implosions of this magnitude do not remain private affairs handled quietly between a broker and a client. A $50 million default triggers immediate automated alarms within the clearinghouses, instantly notifying federal regulators. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not view staggering margin defaults as simple bad luck, especially when the underlying trades bear the undeniable hallmark of attempted insider knowledge. By noon, the SEC Enforcement Division had officially taken over the investigation. They labeled the hedge fund a fraudulent enterprise, initiating a sweeping structural asset freeze. The regulatory net did not stop with the man sitting in a federal holding cell. It extended its reach with lethal precision to the guarantors. Richard and Patricia assumed their liability was limited to the house they had just watched a property management crew gut. They harbored a lingering, desperate hope that they could simply file for Chapter 7, bankruptcy, wipe the slate clean, and start over in a modest apartment. They failed to understand the brutal, unforgiving architecture of federal financial law. Debts generated through securities fraud, malicious trading practices, and willful misrepresentation are strictly non-dischargeable. The bankruptcy courts offer no sanctuary for white-collar criminals. The $50 million margin call was a permanent anchor chained directly to their Social Security numbers. The immediate effects of the federal freeze materialized before the afternoon sun reached its peak. Patricia, shaking and desperate for a semblance of control, walked to a nearby convenience store, leaving her husband and daughter sitting on the curb. She pulled a secret debit card from her pocket. It was tied to a private standalone checking account she had kept hidden from Richard for years, a rainy day fund she assumed was safe from the wreckage. She placed a bottle of water and a cheap prepaid phone on the counter. The cashier swiped the card. The terminal rejected the transaction, emitting a flat, dull tone. She tried to log into her banking application on her phone, her thumbs trembling over the screen. The familiar login portal was gone. In its place, a stark government-issued legal notice filled the display. The Internal Revenue Service, working in tandem with the SEC, had issued sweeping garnishment orders across the SWIFT banking network. Every single financial artery attached to her identity was clamped shut. Richard faced a similar silent execution. His corporate pension, the safety net he had spent 40 years building as a regional manager, vanished from his control. The federal government seized the disbursement pipeline, rerouting the monthly payments directly into a restitution escrow account. They were left with zero liquid capital, zero credit, and zero access to future earnings. Any paycheck they managed to earn, any Social Security benefit they attempted to claim, would be immediately intercepted and funneled toward a debt they could never mathematically repay, even if they lived 1,000 years. Physical violence is fleeting. A bruised cheek fades. A broken bone knits itself back together. The pain diminishes with time, allowing the victim to heal and eventually move forward. True punishment requires a structural dismantling of the target's reality. I did not raise a hand against them. I did not scream insults or hire thugs to intimidate them in alleyways. I merely laid out a string of digital breadcrumbs and allowed their own insatiable appetite for unearned wealth to guide them into the snare. They built their entire identities around the illusion of superiority, looking down on those who worked for a living, sneering at my dedication to my career while demanding the fruits of my labor. I stripped away the illusion, leaving them exposed to the harsh, unforgiving mechanics of the real world. The sheer elegance of the execution lay in its inevitability. They could not blame a random stroke of bad luck. They could not point the finger at a hacker ruining their lives. Every single step that led to their ruin was a conscious choice they made. Chloe chose to steal the corporate card. Marcus chose to commit espionage. Richard chose to leverage his home to fund a scam. Patricia chose to enable the entire charade. I simply removed the safety protocols and let gravity do the rest. The Wall Street ecosystem functions as an apex predator, consuming those who do not understand its rules. They wanted to play in the deep waters without knowing how to swim. The realization of their permanent enslavement to the federal government settled over the three figures sitting on the suburban sidewalk. The passing cars slowed down, neighbors pointing and whispering, capturing the final pathetic chapter of the family legacy on their smartphones. There was no rescue coming. There was no wealthy relative left to exploit. The parasitic ecosystem they had meticulously cultivated collapsed inward, crushing them under its immense weight. The financial execution was flawless, leaving no room for appeals, no loopholes, and no escape. The ledger was finally balanced. They had traded their daughter for the hollow promise of status, and the transaction yielded a lifelong sentence of unyielding poverty. The trap had closed, sealing them inside a prison constructed entirely of their own greed, preparing the stage for my final exit from their lives. The sharp chime of crystal meeting crystal rang out against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. We stood on the wraparound terrace of my penthouse, the afternoon sun warming the stone pavers beneath our feet. Julian leaned against the glass railing, holding a glass of vintage Cabernet. Maya stood beside him, her posture relaxed, shedding the rigid armor she wore in the courtroom. The air 70 stories above the city streets felt crisp and unburdened. There were no forced smiles. There was no suffocating tension thick with unspoken demands. We were breathing the rarefied air of genuine victory. I looked through the open sliding doors into my living room. The flat-screen television mounted on the far wall broadcast a prominent financial news network. The volume was muted, but the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen spoke volumes. The headlines flashed in rapid succession, detailing the spectacular implosion of a fraudulent crypto hedge fund. News helicopters captured aerial footage of Marcus being escorted out of a federal courthouse wearing a standard-issue detention uniform. His wrists were bound, his head hung low. The charismatic grin was erased, replaced by the hollow stare of a man facing decades behind bars. The financial anchors dissected his ruinous short position, treating the $50 million margin call as a historic cautionary tale. They displayed graphics mapping the flow of stolen corporate funds and highlighted the sheer technical incompetence of a trading algorithm executing a self-destruct sequence based on unverified decoy data. The broadcast cut to secondary footage showing the Atlanta suburbs. The camera zoomed in on the stark red foreclosure sign staked into the manicured lawn of my parents' former estate. The news cycle had transformed their private humiliation into public entertainment. I turned my attention back to the terrace, setting my wine glass on a sleek marble side table. Resting next to my glass was my smartphone. During the past 48 hours, the device had functioned as a command center, launching digital strikes and severing financial arteries. Now the screen remained dark. It did not vibrate with frantic apologies. It did not display threatening text messages from unknown numbers demanding a reversal of the foreclosure. The silence was the most profound reward. When you strip parasites of their resources and surround yourself with ironclad legal boundaries, they lose their ability to project noise into your life. Richard could not afford a prepaid burner phone to harass me. Patricia could not access a computer to draft a guilt-tripping email. Chloe possessed no leverage to bargain with. The restraining orders drafted by my legal team established a physical perimeter, but the financial ruin created an impenetrable vacuum. They were erased from my existence. Julian took a slow sip of his wine, tracking my gaze to the silent phone. He remarked on the stark difference between this afternoon and the reception in Aspen. He confessed that watching his aunt and uncle belittle me for decades had always left a bitter taste in his mouth. He admitted he felt a deep sense of justice, watching the facade crumble right in the middle of the ballroom. Maya nodded in agreement, resting her hand on his arm. She mentioned that her department at the federal prosecutor's office was already moving to expedite the indictments. The paper trail I provided was too pristine to require a lengthy investigation. Marcus would likely be offered a plea deal, requiring him to serve a mandatory minimum of 15 years, just to avoid a protracted trial. The conversation shifted away from the wreckage, transitioning to the future. The corporate landscape at my mergers and acquisitions firm had undergone a radical evolution following the Zenith Holdings takeover. The executive board convened an emergency session to review the security breach attempted by Marcus. Chloe had promised to destroy my career by fabricating an ethics complaint. Her threat died the moment I presented the command line logs proving I had anticipated a cyber intrusion, trapped the hostile actor in a sandbox, and protected the firm from a catastrophic data leak. The board of directors did not view my actions as a family scandal. They viewed the execution as a masterful display of risk management and ruthless efficiency. They recognized that a partner willing to financially sever her own parents to protect corporate assets was a partner capable of steering a multi-billion-dollar fund through any economic storm. The compliance division cleared my record within an hour. The following morning, the senior partners offered me the vacant seat at the head of the table. I was officially named the managing partner of the entire acquisitions division. My ascension was finalized, and my control over the portfolio was cemented. In the weeks that followed, the firm recorded its highest profit margins in a decade. Eliminating the security vulnerabilities and absorbing the predatory lending subsidiaries streamlined our operations, resulting in record-breaking dividends. I picked up my wine glass, taking a moment to survey the empire stretching out below my terrace. The bustling streets of New York looked different when you held the reins. For 34 years, I allowed a biological technicality to dictate my worth. I allowed people who shared my last name to treat me like a stepping stone, a disposable resource designed to elevate their preferred children. I bought their dinners, funded their vacations, and swallowed their insults, operating under the false societal assumption that familial ties require unconditional sacrifice. Standing here in the sunlight, flanked by a cousin who chose truth over toxic loyalty and a prosecutor who wielded the law like a scalpel, the final lesson crystallized in my mind. Blood is merely a biological coincidence. It is an accident of birth, a random sequence of genes that binds you to strangers. True family is an intentional architecture. It is constructed through mutual respect, unwavering support, and a shared commitment to protecting one another. The people who share your genetics do not possess a divine right to drain your bank accounts or sabotage your mental health. When a limb turns gangrenous, you do not negotiate with the infection. You do not offer it a second chance to spread toward your vital organs. You amputate the dead weight to save the host. My parents and my sister chose to act as a malignant tumor feeding off my success while praying for my downfall. I chose the scalpel. I removed them from the equation, and the host thrived. I raised my glass, catching the sunlight in the deep red wine. Julian and Maya raised theirs in return, sealing the silent pact between us. The war was won, and the crown was secure. Never shrink yourself to accommodate the fragile egos of toxic relatives. Never allow anyone to label you a disappointment simply because you refuse to fund their delusions. Build your fortress, secure your assets, and never hesitate to cut the cord when the relationship becomes parasitic. Because sometimes the person they overlook, the quiet sibling they designate as their biggest disappointment, is the only person holding the key to their entire existence. And when pushed past the breaking point, that disappointment is the exact person who will systematically destroy their entire world. If you found satisfaction in watching this predatory family receive their ultimate reality check, let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. Have you ever had to build a legal or financial firewall to protect your peace from entitled relatives? Share your stories of setting firm boundaries below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of corporate vengeance, brilliant takedowns, and the satisfying art of cutting out toxic people. Remember, your success is your own, and you owe nothing to those who try to drag you